Well, with us this morning to take a look at the papers are the Sunday Mirror's political editor, Nigel Nelson, and Annabel Denham, the Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. A very good morning to both of you. I'm still saying Happy Christmas, Nigel. Are you still saying Happy Christmas?
I've just said Happy Christmas to your gallery, yes.
Is that the extent of your decorations, that bit of tinsel?
Only in this room. There's a bit more outside. I can take you out to see the Christmas tree if you like.
Excellent. A bit later, maybe. And Annabel, happy Christmas to you. Great to see you. Thank you both for your time this morning. Lots to discuss, actually, for this sort of strange period between Christmas and New Year. Quite a lot of news around. Annabel, why don't you kick things off for us with the front page of the Eye?
Sure. Well, as you say, a silly season of sorts between Christmas and New Year, but plenty to discuss, although strike action still really dominating, at least the Eye's front page, full front page there, a reminder to us all, but particularly perhaps those in government, that this is not going away as we go into the new year, even under new leadership of the TUC. Here, the Eye is reporting that unions are considering pulling out of next year's pay negotiations. Let's not forget that before Christmas, Steve Barclay was thinking of fast-tracking that process in order that some of the union workers would get their pay rises in advance. So it may mean that there's less wriggle room for the government forcing its hand. But this is also perhaps an inevitable development of the strike action that we've been seeing, that the unions would start to call into question the efficacy and the credibility of pay reviews themselves and the ways in which that they are conducted. But I think that this is quite significant for two reasons, really. For a start, pay awards for around 45% of public sector workers are set by the government on the basis of recommendations from, I think it's 8 pay review bodies. So if this process is disrupted or called into question, then how will pay be decided in the future? But I think also it looks like the unions are becoming increasingly intransigent, and we know how important public opinion could be as industrial action goes on, and headlines like this may turn them away or encourage them to lose sympathy with the workers who are on strike.
Yeah, Nigel, do you think the pay review bodies are fit for purpose?
Well, I mean, the trouble is that they do have to operate within government constraints. So the unions are absolutely right. They're not totally independent. The real problem here is that the government won't sit down and do any negotiation whatsoever. They seem to be determined to tough the whole thing out, rather as Margaret Thatcher did with the miners' strike back in the 80s. But we're talking about strikes right across the piece here. And so on that basis then, if they just sat down and talked about pay increases, there could be some resolution. Rishi Sunak has said double-digit pay rises are not on the cards, but that doesn't mean you couldn't have some kind of settlement below the rate of inflation.
And Nigel, you've got this crazy situation where the teachers' union, this is a story on the front of the Telegraph, teachers' unions fear that ballots for national strike action in the new year have been put at risk by postal strikes.
Yes, that's right. This is the Telegraph is reporting this one with some relish, I think. But yes, that teachers are balloting 500,000 of them for strike action. They've got deadlines coming up on January the 13th and January the 9th. So the problem is that the postal workers being on strike means some of those ballot papers won't get returned in time, which of course means they won't get counted. Now, obviously, this is the downside of trying to take some kind of coordinated action. But it is a bit of an irony that you might find a teacher strike not going ahead because the posties are all on strike.
Exactly. All right, plenty more throughout the morning on strike action. We're speaking to the new boss of the TUC at about 8:30. Annabel, let's turn our attention to the front of the Times, shall we? Labour vow to combat antisocial behaviour. How are they going to do that?
well, this is just another headache for the Tories, isn't it? Labour looking at new ways to pile pressure on the government and really try to encroach on or dominate policy areas that had previously been areas that people trusted the Conservatives to look after. It's declaring itself the party of law and order. You've got a quote there from Steve Reed, the Shadow Justice Secretary, insisting that it's antisocial behaviour that they're going to try and address. And really looking at sentencing, increasing and strengthening community sentences to try and tackle re-offending rates. And it'll be really interesting, I think, as we approach the next general election to see how important crime is to voters, because between 2017 and 2019, it went up quite high on their list of priorities. I think it was the third most important issue to most voters. And when you read reports or data like that in this article that finds 2 million reports of antisocial behaviour in the past 3 years have gone unattended, it's not altogether surprising that many members of the British public are worried that crime is becoming decriminalised, that police are under-resourced and simply don't have the capacity to investigate anything other than very serious criminal offences. So this is quite a smart move from Labour, but of course you can contrast the cover of the Times with the cover of the Express, where Rishi Sunak is pledging himself to make our streets safer after the wave of terrible violence that we saw over Christmas. So perhaps a new battleground is emerging between the Tories and Labour as we get closer to the next general election.
Yeah, give us a thoughts on this one, Nigel, before we move on.
Well, I think that you can see that Labour is now actually coming out with some policy along the way, and this kind of has echoes of Tony Blair's tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. I mean, what Steve Reed is saying is one of the answers to this would be to increase community sentences. They're just not tough enough, according to him. And I think Annabelle's right, that crime will certainly become one of the battlegrounds as we get closer to the election, although, of course, cost of living is still going to be the top issue with voters.
Okay, and sticking with you, Nigel, I know you wanted to talk about this one. It's on the front of the Daily Mail. Pretty punchy headline, this, isn't it? Have Tories given up on cutting tax?
Yes, indeed. And what the Daily Mail is saying, that Jeremy Hunt has pulled a review of future tax cuts. This was ordered by Kwasi Kwarteng when he was Chancellor. I can understand why he has. I mean, it's quite clear we are not going to be able to afford tax cuts in the near future. You're probably not going to see anything coming forward this side of an election. And what Kwasi Kwarteng wanted to do was to try and look at some of the anomalies in the tax system. So, for instance, where high earners over £100,000 find themselves getting a 62% marginal tax rate because their personal allowance is scrapped. He planned to look at all that, but obviously after the disaster of the mini-budget, the one thing the Tories can't do now is start talking about cutting taxes.
Annabelle, it'd be good to get we're going to move on to COVID in a moment, but it'd be good to get your thoughts on this.
Look, I think it's not just about tax cutting, but also about tax simplification. But it's absolutely vital that Britain becomes more competitive if we are going to encourage more entrepreneurs to set up businesses here, if we're going to attract more investment. You know, the UK is set to fall from 22nd to 30th out of 37 OECD nations, according to the Tax Foundation's Tax Competitiveness Index. You know, we're now behind the US, Germany, Canada and Japan when it comes to our tax competitiveness. So I think if we could look at ways of not just trying to cut tax at some point in the future, I appreciate that's extremely difficult now and it needs to come after a supply side reform. But of course that's where Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng went wrong really. They ought to have implemented supply side reforms that would have given the economy a bit of a shot in the arm before looking at ways of reducing the tax burden. But what we really need is to to look at ways of simplifying tax in the short term and cutting taxes over the long term in order that Britain becomes a more attractive place to invest and do business.
Okay, let's turn our attention to COVID then. Front page of The Guardian, and staying with you, Annabelle, Italy is testing Chinese travellers for COVID. China finally opening up after trying to go for a zero COVID policy, pretty much unsuccessfully. And now some countries are saying we are going to test Chinese travellers who arrive, and other countries like the UK say they have no plans to do so at the moment. Do you think they're going to regret that decision, the UK government?
Well, the UK government came under heavy fire, of course, for not acting swiftly enough back in March 2022 and shutting our borders. Now, as far as I'm aware, only 5 countries are implementing or insisting that people arriving from China be tested for COVID-19. Italy is the first European country, not altogether surprising when you think about what happened in Lombardy right at the start of the pandemic. And the lockdown that happened in Italy really made policymakers here in Britain and other European nations aware that lockdown was a tool that they could potentially use to combat and try and mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So, at the moment, it feels like Italy might be acting at about the right time, and England should potentially follow suit. Let's not forget that there was this flight that came over from China, and out of 92 passengers, 35 were positive, so that's 38% of passengers were positive. I think there was another flight where around half of passengers were positive coming into Italy. So this doesn't actually seem like an excessive precaution, but rather quite a sensitive measure. The fear really is that this is just a haunting repeat of what happened in 2022.
It does feel a bit like it does feel a bit like, sorry to interrupt, it does feel a bit like deja vu, doesn't it? I was in Italy right at the very start, Nigel, when they started those restrictions. Just a quick thought from you on this.
Well, I think the one thing we learned from the pandemic was that by the time we would try to close down our borders, testing people as they came in, COVID was already here. So I'm not sure precautions like this are actually going to be hugely effective, because if you've got travellers in the country with COVID, it's a bit late to then test them later.
Yeah, really interesting that, isn't it? Well, it's our top story as well here on Sky News. We'll speak to you both again in half an hour. Thank you very much. And at the top of the hour, we'll have more on that COVID testing regime.